If you ever read the book of Hebrews, you know that its central point is Jesus is better. But why then does the author begin his argument in chapter 1 not with Moses, not with the high priest, but with angels? It seems like a strange theological detour. But here's the secret. Angels are the key to the entire book. And understanding the role of angels in Hebrews 1 and 2 unlocks the Jesus is better argument, which runs all the way through chapter 10. My name is David, and I traced every single Old Testament allusion to angels here in Hebrews 1 to 2 and mapped out all the connections here in this chart. If you want to understand the book of Hebrews, this is the place to start. Now, you can download this chart for free in the description below. The book of Hebrews is written to Jewish followers of Jesus who are being persecuted. The author reminds them of their former days when they endured a hard struggle with sufferings, being publicly exposed, and look at this, joyfully accepting the plundering of their property. But some time has passed since those former days, and that original confidence is shaking. Now, for some of them, this simply means that they were becoming sluggish when they used to be earnest, but for others of them, they are near to falling away. And the author warns them that if they do, after they have already been enlightened, then it is impossible to restore them to repentance. This is serious. You see, as a Jew, they had a special protection under Roman law. They could practice their faith without harassment from the authorities, but they gave up that immunity when they took the name Christian. And therefore, some of these Jews are considering abandoning Christ and returning to Judaism. What would you do if you were going to preach one sermon? That's what the book of Hebrews is. In chapter 13, it calls it a word of exhortation, a sermon. If you were going to preach one sermon to a group of Messianic Jews who were considering leaving the church and going back to the synagogue, what would you say? Well, the author of Hebrews decides to preach a sermon entitled, Jesus is Better. That is his main point from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 10. Jesus is better. He is a better sacrifice in chapter 9. He is the guarantor of a better covenant in chapter 7, which is enacted on better promises in chapter 8. He has more glory than Moses in chapter 3, and his tent is greater and more perfect than Moses's. Now you see, each one of these comparisons forms a building block in the structure and organization of this sermon letter. You see, Jesus is better than Moses, the founder of Judaism, in 3 and 4. He is a better priest than the Levitical priests of Judaism in 5 to 7. And his sacrifice is better than the animal sacrifices of Judaism in 8 through 10. But there are two parts to the message of Hebrews. If these Messianic Jews remain faithful to Jesus, they have everything to gain. Jesus is better. But if they turn their back on him, they have everything to lose. You see, unlike Paul, who groups all of his theology at the beginning of his letter and all of his application at the end of his letters, the author of Hebrews is going to jump back and forth between exposition, exhortation throughout his entire letter. And interestingly, in each major section of the letter, his exposition will focus on a different passage from the Old Testament. So in chapters 1 and 2, the exposition is on Psalm 8. And then in 3 and 4, it's Psalm 95. In 5 to 7, it's Psalm 110, focusing on Melchizedek. And then Jeremiah 31, Habakkuk 2, Proverbs 3, and Exodus 19. But each major section will also include a stern warning. We have an exposition and an exhortation. Because these Jews, if they continue to follow Jesus, they have everything to gain. But if they turn their back on him, they have everything to lose. Now that pattern of exposition, exhortation is going to begin right away in chapters 1 and 2. Chapters which argue that Jesus is better than angels. Here in chapter 1, we read that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God, having become superior to angels. Now, why angels? You see, every other comparison in Hebrews 1 to 10 is going to contrast the old covenant with the new covenant that Jesus inaugurated. 3 and 4, Jesus is better than Moses, better than the priesthood, better than old covenant sacrifices. How does Jesus' superiority over angels further that message? And here's the secret that unlocks Hebrews 1 and 2. Jews believed that Moses received the law from God on Mount Sinai through angels. Look at the last sentence of Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7. Let's go down to verse 51, where he says, "You stiff-necked people, you who received the law as delivered by angels." The law was delivered to Moses through angels. And now Paul is going to make the same point in Galatians chapter 3. So in Acts 7, the law was delivered by angels, but in Galatians 3, the law was put in place through angels. You see, the author of Hebrews in chapters 1 and 10 is going to argue that Jesus is better than angels. But his real interest isn't in Jesus versus angels. His real interest is that the message declared by Jesus is better than the message declared by angels. This is also why the letter opens with a contrast between Jesus and all former prophets. Verse 1, "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he spoke to us by his Son." You see, Jesus, he is the author of a new covenant, and he is the final and complete revelation of God. So we know why Jesus is better than angels, but how is he better than angels? Better in what way? Well, here in chapter 1, we read that Jesus is better than angels. He's superior to them because his name is more excellent than their name. And then chapter 1, the author is going to proceed to list verse after verse after verse from the Old Testament which ascribe names or titles to the Messiah and names and titles to angels. Take a look at this here in our chart. So here in chapter 1, angels are called ministers. They are ministering spirits sent out to serve. Angels, they are servants. But Jesus, he's not a servant. Jesus is the Son. "You are my Son. Today I have begotten you. I will be to him a father. He will be to me a son." The very firstborn son. Jesus isn't a servant like angels. No, Jesus is the Son. And the angels worship him as the Son. Chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "When he brings the firstborn son into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.'" Now they worship him because he is the King. And that is what the title Son implies. Son means King. And we see this in the first quotation about Jesus. "You are my Son. Today I have begotten you." This is taken directly out of the Messianic Psalm, Psalm 2. And then the second quotation, "I will be to him a father, he will be to me a son," is taken from the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. This is the covenant of the king. And then the author of Hebrews is going to quote Psalm 8 in order to prove the point that God did not subject the world to come to angels, no, but rather he crowned Jesus with glory and honor, and he put everything under Jesus's feet. But the author admits that is not what things look like right now. You see, right now, at present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. Because the world, it is a total mess. Jesus' people, the citizens of his kingdom, are being persecuted. That is not the way it should be. But rather, what we do see right now is Jesus, for a little while, made lower than the angels. Lower? I thought that Jesus was better than the angels. Why is he temporarily made lower? Well, the text tells us he's made lower than the angels so that by the grace of God, he may taste death for everyone. This is our great salvation and introduces us to our first warning passage in chapter 2, 1 to 4, where the author asks, how shall we escape if we neglect this great salvation. And then he's going to land the plane with his comparison to angels, where he says, if the message which is declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every disobedience received its retribution. That is, the curses of the Mosaic covenant took place and Israel was hauled off into exile. That's the comparison. Well, what about the message that we heard? The message which is so much better than the message of angels because it was declared by Jesus himself. Well, if we neglect that message, then we certainly shall not escape. That is how the message of Hebrews works. Jesus is so much better than the old covenant practiced under Judaism. You have everything to gain if you give yourself to this great king, but you have everything to lose if you turn your back on him. Now, there's another book in the New Testament which is also written to persuade the church not to turn back to Judaism, and that is the book of Colossians. If you want to see how Colossians employs this same Jesus is better argument, you should check out this next video.